All right, everybody, welcome. This is Project Herpetoculture podcast. I'm your host, Roy Arthur Blodgett, joined as always by the dashing and charismatic Philip Leitz of Arids Only. And we have an awesome show today. I'm really excited to get into this one. And of course, before we do, I'm going to go through our standard housekeeping. And first, I want to acknowledge Charlie, who edits our audio and makes this a listenable experience for all of y'all. So shout out to Charlie. And I also want to talk about Dylan and the Animals at Home Network. Thank you for hosting our show. We're really pleased to be here. This is a good fit for us. And I also want to talk about our sponsors. So we have Custom Reptile Habitats, and they are makers of premium PVC reptile enclosures. And they also carry universal rocks and some other nifty products. So if you're in the market for any of that and you're looking to make a purchase, if you do so through the link in our bio or description, we'll receive a small commission at no additional cost to you. That really helps us keep the lights on here. We also have Cold-Blooded Caffeine, and they are roasters of premium coffees from all over the world. And they donate 5% of each bag of coffee sold to conservation in coffee growing regions that also host some really amazing herpetofauna. So check them out. And if you end up purchasing anything from them, use the code Project Herp for 10% off. And lastly, we have Fairy Tale Dragons. That's Heather Moy and Ron St. Pierre, obviously absolute legends in the field of herpetoculture, and they're producing some incredible stuff, including some amazing bearded dragons. So if you're in the market for those, look no further than Fairy Tale, and follow them along on socials. There's always some really cool stuff that they're doing, and I've learned a lot from following them. So I strongly encourage that. And if you're interested in supporting the show directly, we always welcome subscribers on Patreon. And you can find us there at patreon.com/Project Herpetoculture. So with all of that said, I'm going to hand it over to Phil to introduce our guest.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy. That was great. So our guest today is Steve Sotelo, Exo Terra Division Manager. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I'm really, really excited to have this convo with you, man.
No, I appreciate it too. We've had some conversations offline. I appreciate what you guys are doing, and definitely, we're big supporters of what I think what the end goal is for the Animals at Home podcast, and then the network there too. And I think it was about time we started partnering up with some of the movers and shakers, and certainly the ones that have a solid vision for where the reptile industry needs to go, should go, and ultimately where we all kind of want it to go as it continues to evolve. And then we're challenged with some of the pitfalls that comes with just an industry in general in the U.S. And globally. So, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
So I know that we'll get into, I'd love to kind of unpack some of the stuff that you were just running through in that brief moment. But before we do, can you tell us, maybe we'll make this a two-part question. The first part can be what your personal herpetoculture origin story is, like how you got involved in herpetoculture to begin with. And then secondarily, how you got involved with Exo Terra and sort of what your role is with Exo Terra.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So I'll try to give you the synopsis of my time in the industry. So I think like a lot of other people, right? You have relatives that take you out camping and you start catching stuff. That's the simplest version. And I remember, so I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and we were big camping families on both sides. So my parents would take us out, and then my dad started teaching me how to catch lizards with long reeds of grass with a noose method, probably when I was like 2 or 3. And it kind of just that stuck. So then, normal stuff, right? Dinosaurs goes into dinosaur zoos and so forth. So kind of started really, really early on the interaction with reptiles, just out there catching tadpoles and so forth, and lizards releasing. I probably started keeping, I'm trying to remember when I bought my first lizard, because I would do the normal Western fence lizards. I'd keep them for a couple months, release them in the summer type thing. And then as I got older, when I started purchasing animals, I'm probably in the, 8 years old or so, 8 or 9, started producing reptiles shortly after that, where I would have my leopard geckos way back then, bearded dragons, and go back and sell them back to the pet stores at that time. So certainly, I was born in 1980, so I was probably starting to really sell things back to stores in the early 90s. So pre-internet boom. almost the Wild West in the pet industry, right? When you go into some of these superstores, and just the amount of livestock that you would see was scary and impressive at the same time, right? Impressive as a little kid seeing this stuff that you're probably in the pet trade, you're never going to see again. It's just not there.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think with the lens that I have now, decades removed from that, going, we could have done better. We could have done a little better way back then. So, and that's kind of where everything took off as I transitioned over from, I guess, the bread and butter in the reptile industry, right? Your leopard geckos, your corn snakes, your bearded dragons, and so forth. I became enamored with Madagascan reptiles in general, and just the endemic nature of what was on that isolated island. So where I really started to make a name for myself and then start to work with some odd animals was anything that came out of Madagascar. So I'm going to try to remember if this was 94. I want to say between 94 and 97. I don't remember when Madagascar shut down a lot of the trade. But it was around that time where I remember that's when I was heavily getting into it. So that's when, for example, like Miner's chameleons, Parsons chameleons, a lot of the reed frogs and mantella species that were common at that point stopped being imported. So as the amount of animals that I was keeping in junior high and high school kind of increased a little bit, Madagascar virtually shut down the majority of what they were exporting to the global market. So, Brachysia species, Europlatus species, certainly a lot of the larger chameleon species I was really, really into at that time. And then they became virtually non-existent overnight. So from there, going into my high school days, I almost started to focus exclusively with poison arrow frogs, which obviously not out of Madagascar, and some of the smaller Madagascan species. So leaf-tailed geckos, some of the smaller ones, a lot of the mantellas, and then the Brachysia species that were before bioactive was bioactive. That's kind of what I was working on. So live enclosures. I really got into the weeds on like brumation and cooling cycles, and this stuff was pre-internet days. It's not like we had access to. It was whatever books were available. I relied a lot on Reptiles magazine, like a lot of people during that period. Is like, I would digest whatever I could at that point from the information that was available to me. So it was fun. I mean, I loved it. I loved it at the time. I still love it. I go back to the passion, right, that I had, like those, kind of the blurred out right here, but what you see behind me, a lot of my grow out tanks and quarantine tanks for Europlatus geckos. It's what I dealt with in my, early teens, pre-teens onto right now. I mean, we're talking a long, long time, and they're still what I love the most about this industry and about the animals. And I love the evolution of keepers and care in general. I like how the industry's really caught up a lot in the US, especially when we look at like the Japanese market and the German market, and some of the, mid-European market, where a lot of that live habitat building really took hold in the US. And then I do believe we've taken it to a next level too here, which we often do. So yeah, that's kind of that's really the foundation and the bedrock of where I came into this industry as a whole. Exclusive hobbyist. I wasn't making any money selling leopard geckos to local pet stores. It made sure that I didn't have to spend excessive money on feeders. And that to me was fine. If I can have my animals, I can work with stuff that most people weren't breeding at the time. To me, that was great, right? Like I love that part of it. So kind of dovetails into the second part of the question is what brought me on board with Hagen and Exo Terra. So Rolf C. Hagen and the Corporation for the US started in 1955 in Canada. So we've been around as a company for a very, very long time. You might recognize some of our other brands, like you remember the whole Habitrail thing with hamsters. That was us. Fluval on the aquatic side, that was us. We've got a really strong representation in the market. And post internet boom, I think Rolf Senior and the rest of the management at Hagen up in Canada came over to Emmanuel Van Hagen and worked with him on creating Exo Terra. So we're talking in like around 2000, 2001 or so for a brand. So at that time, I was finishing up college and I was working with a large internet company during the infancy stages of the internet boom for the reptile industry itself. So when Exo Terra and Hagen came to me looking to partner up with us because we had a large national presence, it was like the perfect time to partner up. So for many, many years, we were a strong supporter of Exo Terra, and that was our primary brand. I love the motto of the brand. I think it was our motto's been the same for 20 plus years. It's make your reptiles feel at home. So our goal was to create these museum styles, a different way of doing things. Like we didn't want to pigeonhole ourselves into, well, let's just do an old fish tank, throw a screen cover on it, and then now it's a reptile tank. Like that wasn't what we were trying to do as a brand. So I love that about the brand. I felt that it was a good symbiotic relationship between a large scale national retailer. We had a location in Los Angeles, but we were national. And then many years later, they kind of we were working on transitioning over. Like I was planning to leave the company and do something new. And Exo Terra and Hagen for the US came on board and brought me on, and it just went into brand management almost immediately. So kind of had an idea of what I could bring to the table and vice versa, some of the tools that they had that I can utilize for the US. And since then, I've been managing the US business as the, ultimately it's like the US brand manager, right? That's the division manager. So I work with our marketing department on a lot of our initiatives nationally. I've done a lot on the product development side too, internationally. So there's a lot of products out there that we have under the Exo Terra umbrella that I had a hand in creating. And then I work with our sales team, whether it comes to large accounts or even the small accounts. And everything under that umbrella. It's like, it's a different hat every week, right? Like sometimes it's a sales related thing. Other time it's a marketing related item. But for the most part, it's anything that has to do with the US business and Exo Terra as a brand, funnels through me.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's extremely cool. I mean, I think it's unique because it seems like there's always an element of timing with people who, if you were, because, I think the list of people who were working with reptiles in the 80s and 90s, who then were able to legitimately turn that into some kind of career is probably rather short, And so I think it's pretty remarkable that you were able to sort of capitalize on your efforts and your position to put yourself in a really cool spot for the future, like downstream in herpetoculture. So there's a lot to unpack here and talk about, but something I think would be really good to go over is I'm not sure a lot of people have an idea of how a reptile or amphibian product comes to be in the world. Like in my mind, I think a lot about how, I'll get notices about dog food or cat food recalls all the time, and about how, turns out there's like this weird contaminated liver that went into your dog's. And if it's any one of these brands of dog food, it's like, you should probably send it back and get your money back. Your dog might get sick. Sometimes it kills them or, whatever. And then, we've all heard about, I think I heard some, I don't know how substantiated this is, so it might just be total fake news, but I heard something about like a type of cat food that had some contaminant in it that killed a whole mess of somebody's blue-tongued skinks one time. I don't know the inner working. Oh, wow. So someone's probably going to message me and be like, you idiot, it was so-and-so. But anyway, so I guess I'm curious, and then we all think about the more specialized stuff that all of us use, like whether it's our supplements or our lighting products. So can you give folks kind of an outline about like sort of how a product comes to be and what tests and rigors and things go into generating those products?
Yeah, absolutely. We can kind of go into like the QC process and where the idea starts. So ultimately it's like the big bang, right? We've got an idea for something. Oftentimes it happens in a vacuum and it just explodes, and we could kind of go from there. And then sometimes it takes a lot of care and time in order for it to happen, right? So if we're kind of using that Big Bang analogy, right, all of a sudden we've got these, celestial bodies, but how long did it take for Earth to create life, right? How long did that happen? The thing that I can say is for our launch rate for ideas and products to market is very slim. And I think that probably goes with a lot of other companies in the reptile sphere as well. If I've got an idea for 100 new products, we might launch 6, right? We might launch 10. And it's not for lack of trying to get all those 100 items launched. It's just there's a lot of challenges along the way. It is did we hit the right price point, right? Like is the technology there yet in order to create this item? And then other times it's competitively, it is if we do get it out there and then all of a sudden the market shifts a little bit, where does that leave us? And, I think COVID is a prime example of that. When we look at product development, if we have a little bit of a higher end item, and then all of a sudden our ocean freight to ship from Japan, for example, or China or Europe is exponentially higher than what it was, that cost is a real cost. And all of a sudden it's like, maybe it's the wrong time to launch this item. So that's the broad stroke about how we kind of go about the product development process. Now, when we get into the weeds and the minutia of how this works, usually, we've got brand management globally. I've got myself in the US here. We've got Emmanuel Van Hagen, who's our global category manager, Rick Van Tigel, who is our product manager, and they are both out of our office in Belgium. So we're just outside of Antwerp, I believe. When these ideas kind of start there, we go through the what we want and which vendor and which factory that we have globally are able to produce these items. And at that point, then it comes down to like, okay, so what do we want from this product range? Like, how is this going to impact the industry? Is it worth it? Right? Like, is there a large enough segment of the hobby in order to get this thing off the ground? We look at, because we're a global company, we have to start looking at, okay, this will work in the US, but it will not work in Europe. It won't work in Japan. It won't work in South Africa because there might be some legislation or laws, or maybe the animals that we're trying to create this for are not available in those markets. In which case, can the US only substantiate the cost of developing this new item, right? So it's fun. I've had way more products that we've brought to the table that have not launched than that have. I'm happy and proud of the ones that I've played, that I've had a hand in, that have launched. And then other times, we start looking at getting down to something so, like, for example, I don't think this is necessarily proprietary information, but something that was very, very cool. And this was, oh my God, 2010 maybe, in that range, 2010, 11. So we had this really, really cool unit that was basically a air conditioner for a terrarium, right? Like it helped out with humidity and so forth. You looked at this and it was from the future, like the technology behind it, the microchips and the functionality was this amazing new product. And like, we're looking at this and we're all there in our head office going, well, what's this going to retail for? Right? Yeah. So we went so far down to where we had the microchip made, we had the molds, at least the sample molds done, the electronics there, the testing was pristine. And then it came down to, well, right, so this is going to get to a retailer for X dollars. That retailer is going to sell it for X times 2. And now all of a sudden it's it gets to the average public. The average public's not going to spend $1,200 on it. It's not going to happen.
No. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the product wasn't great. It's just, it's not worth, what we kind of say in the manufacturing world is flipping the light switch on at the factory level, right? It's not worth that, flipping it on and starting that process if ultimately it's just not going to hit the right notes. So, we've done a lot of that. We've had some amazing products over the years, that are often 5 years too early. It happens so often with us as a company, and certainly as a brand, where we're very proactive in our thinking and product development. We're like, well, we can see where it's going, and we're going to fill a need with this product, but we might be a little too early. So sometimes it slows things down for us a little bit because we're too early and the market's just not there yet. So, prime example of that, we had, this is maybe 2014 or so, we had a product called the Habisphere. It was an amazing new style of enclosure, completely rimless. And we were able to bend the glass to create like a deli case. So the entire thing had a bent glass in front of it. So I had a slope. So you can look at it from all angles, not just the front, the sides, from the top. And we were the first to include LED lighting in the fixture itself. So I had plant growth, 6500K LED lighting. It had a smart tap function. So when you tapped our logo at the top, it went from daylight to night light to off. And you were able to create like a bioactive habitat in it, switch backgrounds or so. We were too early, right? Like the cost on it was just not to where it was gonna retail and really set the industry on fire. But, we go now and I've got people, this is almost 10 years removed, begging me for the product. Right. It's now all of a sudden like, well, now it makes sense. And the cost is there where people understand like, okay, it's going to be a little bit more, but here we are. So, so that's, I could button that up with the product development mill on when things work and when things don't work. Now I could get into the actual development and like the QC side of things. So when we generally launch things, especially when we look at like lighting, for example, or heating, stuff that's more health related than aesthetic, when we start to do stuff like that on the QC side of things, we often use outside agencies. So for anything that's electrical, for example, we will go through the painful process oftentimes of going through like UL, for example. In the US, we have a European version, ETL, the Canadian version, CSA. There's a lot of these agencies that are basically certify your product to make sure they're safe for home use and personal use. So when we go through that, sometimes it's off by a little, right? Or the language isn't there yet in order to certify something. It doesn't mean that it won't be in the future. It's just for right now, they don't test these items. So we're always want to make sure we check as many of those boxes as possible to make sure that these elements are not only safe to use, but that we're going the right direction as a brand. So that's one thing on the electrical side. On the supplement side, for example, or on the nutrition side of things, everything's batched, right? So when we import new shipments, there's a batch number and a lot number to everything that we bring in. And this is often the case with like electrical or even like a high K, for example, or a water bowl. We just want to make sure that we're able to track things if there is a major issue so that we know the bay it is in the warehouses, right? We've got a Las Vegas warehouse and a warehouse that's just outside of Boston. And we can go through and say, okay, lot 1, 2, 3, 4, we have X amount of complaints. Can we pull this so that we could send it out for testing? Can we pull this, plug it in to see if there are any issues or if this is an isolated event? We've got a production facility in outside of Montreal too, where we do produce a lot of our supplements, our liquids, and our foods for reptiles and fish and other pet segments. And that's even more stringent when it comes down to, because it's a nutrition thing. And as you mentioned with like cat food, is we have to be sure. We always have to be sure. So I don't remember this as fun. I was having this conversation last week, but I know we keep the food for an extended period of time. So that way we can go back. So if it's like a liquid, for example, like a water supplement, a dechlorinator, we will have a sample of that so that we can go back, even if it's years removed, we can go back and retest it, even though the original one had tested and there were no issues. So, it's all about accountability with us. More importantly, it's about transparency too. We just want to make sure that we provide the most amount of data that we can to the end consumer, and then our retailers too. They have to understand that. I'm glad you're asking these questions because they don't often get brought up, because our retailers have been dealing with us for decades at this point, right? Like they know what we're about. But you did mention it. The vast public might not understand that there is a lot of care that, we are a global company. We're pretty well known in the market, definitely in the US from the product manufacturing side, but we're also keepers, right? Like I just went over, I'm a Madagascar nerd. Like I'm, the animals that I work with, I'm still very, very passionate about it. I use our products on my own animals. And, more importantly, we're so on top of anything that pops up if there's an issue, right? We're not dismissive about it. We want to know about it. We want to know is like, I love this product range. I'm not so happy about this substrate, right? Like I liked your light here, but I think you guys could do a little bit better. Sometimes it's hard to hear, but other times it helps us with the product development side because we can take that back and say, there's a niche that we're not filling from the manufacturing component. Right? The public wants this. Now, can we do it? Maybe not now, but maybe in a couple of years when the technology's there and the manufacturing processes globally are available to us. Now, all of a sudden, we can create the Ferrari in the market versus the serviceable car. Your Hondas and Toyotas, for example, amazing vehicles. Love them to death, but sometimes someone wants to pay a little bit more to get some more features, and that's okay too, right? Like we can be both. We can be the company that's both of those things. So yeah, that's product development for us in a nutshell. We've got some amazing vending partners globally that we've been using for many years, and oftentimes it's really wild that I can sketch something out. And we've got artists there that actually do the molds. Like we're not just doing some 3D printing in a machine. Like literally we'll get some handcrafted items and then all of a sudden it'll be, wow, this is amazing. Like, how did you do this? Like, I spent like 4 days sculpting this new cave for you guys based on the drawings that we provided. The other side of this that I didn't necessarily get into when it comes to Exo Terra as a brand and on the product development side, something that is exclusive to Exo Terra and something that I don't think we get enough credit to it, or it's not as visible. But, a lot of people do know that as a brand, we've done many research expeditions globally. It's something that we've built our brand off of, and I don't remember what it is at this point, 12, 15 or so. It used to be every year. Now we're kind of taking a little bit of a step back and doing things a little more focused than we have in the past. But when we do these research expeditions, we collect all of the data that's possible. We look at animals there when it looks at humidity, heating, and lighting, the cultural impact of said animal. Emmanuel Van Hagen is very, very keen on the cultural component of how reptiles interact with local tribes or local government in those areas. And it's really easy to brush over when you're looking because you want to see some cool reptile images, right?
Right.
You want to see our Jeep get stuck in the mud. Like that's what people are watching our videos for. But, we do take the time. There's a really great picture on our website for I want to say it's the Kenya expedition, which is maybe 6-ish years ago. So he spent time with a lot of the villagers that were local to this chameleon expedition that we did in Kenya that were removing chameleons from their gardens. Right. So very apprehensive at best about these animals. They were almost, you look at them like, well, they're a pest. They're in my garden. He took time to go through and work with our guides there and communicate saying, listen, they're actually removing all your pests. Like they're removing the locusts. They're removing these animals that are problematic to you. These are animals that should be conserved in the wild. Right. And it's random. I mean, I don't know if many of us had a chance to go to, places where chameleons are natural, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Madagascar. We see them and we expect this grand, this amazing rainforest where this Parsons chameleon is 80 feet above the forest floor. And all of a sudden you turn to the right and this thing is outside of someone's house on a bush.
Yeah.
Right? That stuff happens. That stuff happens. And we want to make sure that we don't leave our footprints behind without actually providing something positive as well, right? Like we're not there just to take advantage of this natural resource, film some videos, and then leave. Ultimately, we try to make it better than it was prior to us getting there. And even if that's a conversation with 3 or 4 people that want to remove their chameleons from their garden, so be it. That's just the way it is. So that mantra that we have as a brand when we do these expeditions rolls over in the product development side, right? There's a lot of lighting that happened that we've produced, and some new lighting that's coming out in early Q1 of 2024 that take into account all of the research that we've done in the Sonora Desert, in Madagascar, in Tanzania, in Honduras, in Costa Rica, in Panama. Like, we've been everywhere globally in some of these hotspots. And then all of a sudden we start looking at changing the way we really view reptiles and how electronics also plays into the function of some of these automated machines that we do. Like, for example, the monsoon, our misting system, and how that plays, and even how some of the normal conventional thinking on how these items have done for many, many years, on how that's shifting a little bit too. And for as big of a brand as we are globally, we want to make sure that we're providing the right amount of information, and then let you decide, right? Like, Philip, Roy, you could decide to purchase the product, but we want to make sure that you've got everything in front of you to make the right decision for that animal. And as a brand, we also need to pivot immediately if the care requirements from those animals change, which in the US, it happens fluidly. Like, we've all seen it from all the animals that we keep. It's what was done 10 years ago is very different than what's done now. Sometimes because products are available, but other times it's, hey, we've thought that this desert animal loved dry, 30% humidity, 100 degrees, and that's how they thrive. But meanwhile, we've got them in a beef jerky machine.
Yeah.
Some people are carrying them.
Yeah, totally.
But Philip, you work with a lot of desertine animals. These animals are often in root structures of bushes or underneath in burrows, and that humidity is all of a sudden 60%, 80% at time, but they go upstairs and it's 115 degrees and 20% humidity. Like, we have to take that stuff into account when we're developing our terrariums and our naturalistic enclosures. And we have to also realize that we can't, their territory might be, 100 yards worth of territory. And how are you going to get all of that in a box that's this big? It take into account.
It's like,
of course.
Sorry, I hope you guys can't hear these leaf blowers outside. They're doing a bunch.
No, not at all. Okay,
cool. It would be as if you looked at a person who lived in, Antarctica, like some Eskimo, and you set up like a habitat for this person that was like the Arctic or setup, but then you never looked into the igloo. You never looked inside the igloo to see like what the temperatures inside the igloo would be like. You'd be like, well, they can survive this. It's like, well, yeah, but there's like this thing. This is like an integral part of what they do. It's like it's the same thing like looking at like a desert animal without considering the burrow. It's pretty fascinating. There's this. I've been thinking. So I want to scoot back just a little bit into the product stuff a little bit longer, because I've been thinking a lot about sort of the balance between the old saying that like knowledge is power, and the kind of knowledge and power that you can gain from investigating whatever topic it is that you're working with, but then also in an industry like herpetoculture, where it's likely that some kind of innovation in some regard is going to be like required for the future, because so much of what we're doing is changing. And so in my, again, not that I'm some expert on innovation or anything like that, but it does seem like a substantial amount of innovation can come from ignorance, or maybe not even ignorance, but like newness, right? Like, it turns out this person who spent their entire life working with bonsai trees and then decided to get into butterfly agamas, well, he came up with this one really weird thing, and it was because he didn't know any better. He didn't have like this pre-existing amount of knowledge that made him assume this was the way we have to do things. You mentioned, well, we don't want to just take a fish tank, put a screen top on it, and call it a reptile tank, right? So I'm sort of curious about the ways that Exo Terra thinks about that sort of thing. How do you guys think about ideation and innovation, and balance those two things? And then sort of like a side or maybe like semi-related question is, do you guys like borrow or piggyback from other industries where there's existing tech or existing applications that work in herpetoculture too? I mean, I know that's kind of a lot, but I hope that made some sense.
No, it does. It does. I followed. As I mentioned with the pivoting, so we've got the luxury of having other brands under our umbrella, right? Like especially aquatics, where we can take a lot of their items that have worked for the aquarium industry, and all of a sudden, like, oh, hold on a second, I think we can actually use that for the reptile side of things if we change things up a little bit. And I kind of the comment that you made and then the questions that you asked, I kind of roll that into happy accidents. Right. It's you run into something and all of a sudden like, oh, that worked. That's really interesting. Now I need to do some more research onto why that worked. Right. Like, was this an anomaly, or is this something that I should share with others because I think it could be impactful and positive for the industry? I mean, we're all in it too, right? Just because our care works for the conditions that we're in doesn't always necessarily mean that that's going to translate to every single person who keeps that animal, right? Like how I brewmate my animals, how I work with I'm in Chicago right now. Sometimes my natural room temperatures help out with what I'm doing. But when I was in Southern California, I couldn't rely on room temperature to help out, especially when it comes to cooling. So again, happy accident, right? My breeding success with certain species all of a sudden amplified moving out to the Midwest, whereas I had such trouble doing that in Southern California. So happy accidents along the way, right? Something I can't take credit for that. I can't take credit for the weather, the weather change when I moved across the country. The other side, as far as us taking the information and moving with it as we're developing, is there are often, this might not answer your question, but it got me thinking. There are often times where we will launch a product with thinking that this is tunnel vision, right? Like here are the features and benefits. Here are the problems it's going to solve. And then all of a sudden, years later, whoa, hold on a second. I didn't realize that it would be great for this animal or this segment. I wasn't 100% sure. And now we can go back, retell the story, refilm some information, put it on our YouTube channels or our website. And all of a sudden we're double dipping on a product that we had no idea, because now things have changed a couple years removed from that. So that's certainly one element of being able to take a look at everything globally, for example. I can also mention this too. Are you guys familiar with, I hope I'm not, because I haven't spoken with him personally in many years, but Peter Netchus?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So chameleon godfather type person.
Yeah, of course.
A wealth of information, right? And this goes into the comment I made with the burrows when it comes to like animals that live in extreme environments. When a lot of information, common convention for chameleons, for example, was if they're drinking, keep misting them. If they're drinking, keep misting them. Get the humidity up. The only way you're going to do it is by using a spray bottle or an automatic misting system, right? Just the way it is. So, but when we start looking at the actual research in these animals in the wild, a lot of times they're inhaling normal relative humidity in their environments, especially at night when, fog layers would come down, or just that natural, temperatures would cool. So they're not losing as much internal hydration, and they're actually breathing it in. So when I talk to consumers, especially at trade shows, I go through, I'm like, let me paint. I'm a master at analogies, by the way. I might not always be right, but I know where I want to go. It's almost like, I don't remember what the data is, but when we take a flight, it's something like just from being on an airplane from Los Angeles to New York, you're losing like something like 2 cups of water just from breathing. Yeah. And all of that is coming out of your lungs. So why shouldn't we expect reptiles in a home environment to experience the same thing? Or sorry, why shouldn't we? So when we looked at chameleons in general, and certainly when we looked at desert reptiles, we took a step back and we looked at hydration levels and what we're really trying to do in the story we're trying to tell. And it became a two-pronged attack. We looked at our misting system and how that integrated with, for example, our new hydrostats and thermostats, right? Hydrostats and thermostats. So when people are asked like, oh, that's great, I can plug your misting system in for my chameleon and I can set my humidity and it's fine. We're like, well, hold on. We also had to make sure we communicate and educate you properly. when you turn on a misting system with a normal hygrostat or something like that, right? It's spraying it. If your misting system is on the opposite side of the cage, it's going to be very, very humid and wet right there. But where your probe is, it might not be. So what's it really reading? Right? Like, what are we doing to the animal? Are we oversaturating the enclosure in the animal? Is the animal beta finning? Is it going to be a health issue later on? Is there too much moisture? So now we have to start looking at bacterial and fungal issues as well, right? So it's complicated and all of this, and I can talk at length for hours about this, but at the same time, as a company, we want to be responsible and give the active consumer everything available to them, right? Maybe you might not want to use the monsoon with this hygrostat, and instead just use it on a timer so that you have a backup for the animal to have moving water and you're able to monitor and spray your plants. Now, when we get back to the hydration side and the whole Peter Netch's situation, he's very keen on these animals are, and I'm paraphrasing here, often irregularly drink in the wild because they're inhaling so much moisture. So are we stressing the animal out by spraying them down nonstop? Yeah. Or should we start considering doing some nighttime fogging, right? And kind of playing with that to see how that integrates in their environment. When we look at animals that are semi-fossorial or that use burrows or root systems in the wild, these animals are also, finding that balance, right, Philip? When we kind of talked about we can't mimic nature 100%, but we could try to get as close as possible without having a detrimental effect to the animal. So that went into when we started looking at how our hydration systems worked with our terrarium control systems. And at the same time, we were looking at some of the newer substrates that we've developed. We've got a substrate that has been picking up traction, really grassroots, called Stone Desert, where it's a harvested underground material it's a composite of like decomposed granite, clay, sand, grit, and it's about as natural as you could get. So if you go hiking in Arizona in August and you look at the ground, it looks like that, right? But when we started testing this stuff and we spent years going over like, okay, so what are the pros and cons to it? How do we make sure we communicate what it can actually do? When we are looking at internal hydration, especially when it comes to inhaling this level of hydration with relative air humidity, it's like, well, these animals why can't we create a burrow system that's not just aesthetic, right? Like it's not just a cave, but this substrate almost works as a sponge where it's slowly releasing humidity over the course of a day, weeks or so. And then all of a sudden, all you need to do is add a little more water to that burrow and the substrate will suck it up, again, slowly release it. So, we start running into positives where shedding issues aren't as big of a deal. The animal's hydrated, right? And maybe it's not drinking water anymore because it's actually coming out fully hydrated. So, and then it is a snowball effect from there, right? We start looking at impaction and what impaction really is and how the public views impaction and what impaction very much is versus what a veterinarian will tell you it is versus what a manufacturer and caregiver will tell you it is versus what a researcher and reptile vet will tell you it is. There's a lot of cause and effect that go into it. And ultimately we start looking at, we're treating the symptoms sometimes instead of finding out what the problem is and actually providing a solution, which is, hey, maybe if we provide a burrow that's kind of natural and humid for these animals, I use humid loosely, right? 60% could be humid to an arid animal. And then all of a sudden these animals are becoming hydrated and all their mucous membranes in their digestive system are all of a sudden kickstarted and they're metabolizing food correctly, right? Their waste levels, their moisture and their waste levels are all of a sudden almost non-existent, but they're pooping in a healthy manner. So, we start going down different paths and we're spider webbing across where I get excited and care because to me, why I was one of the reasons I was actually very, very happy to come on this podcast is I like stuff like that. Like I enjoy how it's one pebble starts an avalanche of information and you're like, oh, this all makes sense to me. Doesn't mean that I need to use it, but at least now we have it and we could start looking at how our care is relative to that information and how we can improve, right? Yeah, some people are okay keeping their animals on paper towels. Some people want this elaborate, crazy setup that is, I have my bearded dragon here, so I want to try to find plants that are endemic to Australia or Madagascar, right? Like depending on the animal, and that's great, but there's limits to that too. And as long as we know that the information's there and we can rely on that and go back in case something goes wrong, which it often does, then we're like, okay, let me remove this element of my care. Let me remove this product. Let me adjust this product and then ultimately make it better for the animal. So I don't know. I think I kind of got off track a little bit for that question, Philip, but I think that's what you were asking.
That's exactly what I was asking. Yes, that was perfect. Not off track at all. Not off track at all. I mean, please feel comfortable. Feel free to, take these in any direction. That's the whole idea.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's what we want. The more you're talking, the better.
Yeah.
And,
that's true.
Yeah, and I mean, I love this. I love this kind of more. I feel like you're just describing looking at things a lot more holistically, which is something that I feel like we can do a lot more of within herpetoculture, just broadly speaking. And again, by kind of looking at herpetoculture more broadly, I'm curious if there's like a sector within like the reptile specialty product world where you see the greatest room for growth and innovation. Like, is it in lighting? Is it in caging? Is there something that stands out in that way to you?
Yeah, I've, again, I think it's one of those things that we might not necessarily get enough credit for, but it's also like we've got other fish to fry. Like often it's, we can't just say like, hey, look at this new thing we created and how it changed the industry. Meanwhile, we're like, well, we have to keep going, right? Like we just can't sit on a product and our expectation is this is the end all be all and this is where it stops. I could kind of, just because we're getting close to when this item's going to launch, and certainly where it's going to be in early Q1 of next year, and our retailers have seen it at some of the industry shows. But we spent a lot of years and a lot of, when I went to that QC item and the testing outside labs and so forth, of finally launching our LED UVB items. So these are supposedly supposed to, knock on wood, hit the market in January. And I could kind of chat a little bit about how that plays into where we're looking at, are there holes to fill? I'm sure, I don't know if how widely known this is or how the information is spread, but, with the US and the whole incandescent ban that went live a couple months ago, I think, maybe 2-3 months ago. A lot of fear mongering that goes along with information. There's also a real world scenario when we look at manufacturing that we have to start looking at alternative sources in case something gets nixed from the hobby, right? And one of the technologies that are available to us now are LED lighting. So we've been working on, I can tell you, we've been looking at LED lighting for 10 years. Right. Like, so not new to the game. So we understand the limitations of LED lighting, especially when it comes to UVB light. And we also know where we're at now on the manufacturing side. We're like, listen, we're going to create the best that we can with the materials that are available to us, and then make sure that we provide the public with the data so that they can decide where these new lights are going to fit into their care spectrum. Right. So when we looked at LEDs, for example, we could have launched them years ago. And we wanted to make sure that the industry shook out first, and that the manufacturing sector actually took into account everything, right? What the actual spectrum is, where the light output is. So as far as visibility goes for like you and I, or plant growth, and then everything in between, right? Like, the spectrum is what's when we get into the complicated nature of lighting, right? Like, it's what's coming out of the sun is this. But when we start looking at UVB is right here. And then when we look at what positive usable UVB, we're talking about a small sliver of what that is. And oftentimes it just kind of gets a little convoluted in naming systems, right? Like a 5%, a 10%, we were, and we're kind of guilty of it too, because we were the first to go into the everything beyond a 5.0. We did the 8.0 and 10.0. So, we were playing into that system. But again, that's where the industry was at the moment. right? We looked at a tropical bulb and trying to use it on a desert animal. Was it, aside from getting closer to the animal, was it really a positive net effort to us to stick with one type of bulb? So we started looking at, metal halides, mercury vapor lamps, compact fluorescence, HOT5 linear fluorescence, and where that industry is going. So we can't stop where this is. We have to advance, and we have to make sure that we are conscious that, hey, in 6 months, this technology might change again. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
So we're finally at the point with our LEDs where we're like, okay, we're happy with where this is going. I think on the manufacturing side and the cost side, we could get something where people are going to understand and also do something that's incredibly usable. Right. So Cat's kind of out of the bag on this, but so Exo Terra in January is launching a linear LED UVB that's fully controllable. So we have a remote control where you can actually reduce or increase the amount of UVB and UVA output along with your actual light quality, like your high color temperatures for plant growth and visibility, right? We've been sitting on it for a long time, just making sure the technology was there. We were able to increase the light dispersion from our LEDs. So instead of doing like a 60 degree or 90 degree, which is common, we've got 120 degrees. So it's got a much broader range across the terrarium. And ultimately that controllability gives you the option to go, well, I want to put this over my red-eyed tree frogs, but I also want to do one over my bearded dragon and my chameleon. And you can literally take your meters, like if you use any of your monitoring meters, and go through and adjust it according to where you want it to be. So instead of us just throwing a light out there, right, a tropical LED, a desert LED, now you can literally go through saying, well, on this enclosure, it's only 12 inches tall, but on this other one, it's 18 inches tall. So I've got a remote and a meter to go through and actually reduce or increase accordingly. So we're very excited, very, very excited about it. I think it's got an IP54 rating on it too. So this LED fixture is virtually waterproof. So if you've got any mineralization or, as I mentioned, a misting system or a humidifier, you're not going to get anything that's going to affect the actual microchips or the LEDs themselves because it's virtually sealed. Right. So very sleek. So something that we're excited about, but it's time that we have to push our hand forward in the industry. And it's also to get back into that incandescent band, like at a certain point when we start looking at fluorescent lighting, the same thing's going to happen for the for this side of the industry for pets, right? Where maybe we're going to be forced to have to go to LEDs. And at what point, what is Exo Terra doing as a brand to monitor all of the information and impact on animals, which we're very, very on top of as it is. So as we're going through the manufacturing, we're working at tests, we're sending them out to independent labs. And then, we take not criticism, but we take opinions very, very seriously on how this impacts the animal, right? It does all of these things, but what about this? Let's write it down. Let's see if we could go back to that and check out what this is going to mean to the industry as a whole, and where this plays. Now, with LEDs, for example, it's not like we can create one all of a sudden overnight that's going to go on someone's enclosure that's 6 feet by 6 feet by 4 feet. Right? This isn't going to plug that hole. You're going to need to find additional sources of light for that. So there are limitations for everything, right? There's limitations for linear lighting. There's limitations for mercury vapors. For any types of fluorescence, whether it's compact, HOT5s, or your standard T8 linears. And you as a keeper have to make sure that you have this information in front of you so that you can select the best option for your particular animal or your particular habitat, right? Sometimes it's not even the animal. It's, I've got plants and moss at the bottom of my enclosure. My UV is fine, but I need some light in order for my plants to grow at the bottom of this enclosure. We have to keep all of that in mind. Something also that's part of this conversation in regards to us changing as we advance. Since 2012, we've provided all of the, or at least the relevant lighting information on all of our heat lamps and UVB and visible light lamps, which means on the packaging, it'll give you your UVB rating at any given distance, your UVA, your lux, your lumen, your vitamin D3 production, which is a very real thing that most manufacturers and the growing public don't take into account. Is UVB is great at a high level occasionally, but if it's not actually providing the right amount of metabolism of D3 in the animal that you keep, is it doing more harm than good? Right? Which side of that UVB spectrum, as I mentioned, sunlight, UVB, usable UVB.
Right.
A lot of these meters are measuring all sides of this. So they're measuring toward the UVA side and the UVC side, but it's still UVB. So we have to take accountability for that, right? And as a brand, we want to be as transparent as possible, which is why we provide this information on the packaging. Oftentimes it's overkill, but it's there, right? Like it's my common theme as as I grow as a person, and then certainly in this industry, is there's no such thing as bad information. There might be some bad news, but the information itself is, you can choose to use the information. Here's all of it. You can decide on your own, as long as you have it in front of you, and you can trust the brand moving forward. And then you could ultimately decide, it's not for me right now. I want to sit on it a little bit. Let me see how this product really works, and then maybe I'll go through. Anecdotally, let me talk to someone who's been working with these items for years, substrates, right? Decor items, terrariums, UVB lighting. And is it working for you? What do you think about it? Are you comfortable about it? That's how this reptile game has worked for decades. Sometimes it just takes some time for something to take root.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man.
I'm curious also, just like along this kind of similar lines, but getting a little bit more kind of maybe a little goofy with it. Like for you specifically, I mean, you're a reptile keeper, you're a reptile nerd. I say that affectionately.
I accept it affectionately.
What is your dream reptile product? Like what's that thing out there that you wish that you had? I'm just curious if there's something that stands up. Phil talks about like this like rotating light track. Which
that's what which I
love.
Yeah, I wanted to really quick. I just want to elaborate on that, like, because when we're talking dream product, we're talking like you literally had a dream about it, and it might not even be possible, right? Because the one that Roy mentioned, that I mention all the time, is I envision like this like orb bulb that's like this insanely high powered heat UV full spectrum lighting combination that is on a track where it can both track across a pen and around a pen. You know what I mean? So it's so stupid. It's like, bro, just put them outside. Just do it. Just just use the sun. But
I get it. You're going full heliocentric lighting, right? So basically you're using seasonal rotations of the sun, and you want something to mimic that in a enclosed environment.
Yes.
Yeah. I get it. I think it could be fun. I get what you're saying. So I can't say too much yet. But we've got a big launch. Got a big launch coming next year.
Okay.
That when we're looking at what Philip's talking about, and then certainly what a dream scenario for myself as a keeper, we're going to be launching next year. It's
awesome.
I do not often get floored with products, because I know how the sausage is made. Right. So for me, I'm there are times where I'm looking at the industry through a microscope, and there are times where it's a 30,000 foot view, right? Where you're on a plane, you get to see everything. And we have to be able to look at the industry through all of that in order to make the best decisions. So when this new product that we're launching, or product line that we're launching later on this year, is when I first saw it or caught wind of, this is the direction we're going as a brand. Wow. I'm like, I go, can it do this? Can it do that? Can it do, what can't it do at this point? So
yes.
I wish if this was 6 months from now, I could probably mention more about it. But from what I understand, what we're trying to do is there's a giant trade show in Germany called Interzoo, and it's every other year on even numbered years. And this is where we're going to showcase this new Exo Terra addition to our line. Like, it's going to be our baby, right? Like, it's industry shakeup material. I think it's about time. But also too, this goes into the broad conversation that we've had for, since we started the call. It's the technology's there now where we can do something like this versus what we want to do, right? Like, Philip, your ideas, I got it. Like, I knew exactly when you said something rotated, I'm like, I know he's going to talk about a sun going over an enclosure. Like, I know it. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's not something that can't happen in the future or where the technology is going to change on that. I think that there are a lot of substitutions that can happen in between now and then that are going to compensate for that. We're like, oh, I never thought about that, but that's amazing that now there's an element out there that can accomplish something like that. So that's the cheater's way around that answer about what Roy asked about what I would like to see. I think I could probably take a little bit of a different direction on that as well. Like what I think I want to see from the industry as a whole, and what we're trying to do and make sure that we have a cohesive story as an industry, right? And some people don't like using it as industry. Some people like keeping it as a hobby. To me, it's almost interchangeable at times. There are people that keep their lights on by breeding reptiles. I know hundreds and thousands of them, right? So it's hard not to say it's an industry. Some people, it's a hobby where it's like, listen, I've got my one strawberry poison arrow frog that I've had for 12 years. That's my baby. That's why I'm in this thing right now. And that's great. It's beautiful. I love that too.
Love it.
The part that I like more and more, and I do see it happening, maybe not to the speed that I see it happening, that I would like for it to happen, but the free exchange of ideas and evidence is great. I think that it's one of the reasons I love these long format situations, because we can immediately be asked, right? Like, I didn't have a script coming on.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I know,
Boy, dude, you had a script.
Yeah. Hold on, let me turn the page. Let me turn the page. So I think that in this situation, in preparation, I know my brand. I know what I know from the industry. It doesn't mean that I'm not learning as we go, but I love being able to sit there with someone in this situation and go like, well, let me hear the positives and the negatives. Like, I want to know, right? No such thing as bad information. Let me decide how I want to use this and how applicable it is for what we do as a brand as well. So, we do so many large trade shows around the US, which has greatly affected my back and tennis elbow and everything else from being on a plane so often. But it's a beautiful thing when you go out there, and oftentimes the public will come up to us and say like, hey, you know what? I have this problem. I didn't want to say anything or complain. I go, no, please let me hear it. And it'll often be a quick fix, right? Like, it'll be something like, oh, I'm like, yeah, we'll replace it. It's not a problem. Or it'll be something like, you know what? My cat ruined the top of my enclosure. It's been sitting in my garage for 7 years. I can't do anything about it. You guys should consider doing a new one. I'm like, we have replacement tops for those, right? Like, I'll send you one. It's not a big deal. But, a lot of that stuff is the education side too. When we start talking about, for example, how care and overall health of the animal also ties to like impaction or dehydration. Sometimes I get the opportunity to sit there with someone, as long as they want to take the time with me at a trade event, and let's talk about it. Let me explain it to you. Doesn't mean I'm going to change your mind, but at least like, hey, go read this article, go check out Peter's chameleon information. Like, dude has encyclopedias worth of information out there, and even sometimes, and he pivots too. Right, when he learns something new, he's very want to change as he evolves and through his travels. So I think that's a beautiful part about where I think the industry is changing up a little bit. We see it some with like chameleon care, for example. We see it some with naturalistic environments. The the big one that I really, really enjoy and I think is going to continue to take hold as long as we use the right language behind it is environmental enrichment. Right.
Yeah.
Like we see it at the zoo level to a degree. We see it at like large aquariums like the National Aquarium. We see it at like Scripps in San Diego. We see it at like Shed Aquarium out here in Chicago, where you start taking into like making sure the animals' lives are not only benefited from the setup itself, like your terrarium or your enclosure, but also like how they interact with that environment. Are we doing what's best for them, right? And we start learning stuff with, and I love the university studies and a lot of the science stuff that unfortunately there's paywalls behind trying to get some of these studies and research. But you start looking at brain activity, right? And you start looking at like, just like us with health foods and antioxidants and, omega, fatty acids, omega-3s, like all of this stuff plays into how the animal interacts. And oftentimes heating and lighting and environmental enrichment go into it's so hard to qualify and quantify this, right? But the happiness of the reptile.
Yeah.
I can tell right, guys. I mean, you guys know you can tell. Right. Like I've had dogs my whole life. Like I know when my dog is smiling. Is she really smiling?
Oh yeah.
I can tell like this dog is happy that we're doing this activity, that we're hiking, that we're playing Frisbee. She's happy about it. And oftentimes with reptiles, we have to rely on activity levels. Is the animal moving back and forth all over the enclosure, right? Mm-hmm. Is it a little aggressive? That's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's like, I want that food out of your finger right now because you're doing the right thing, right? Is it digging? Are you giving it the ability to dig? Because these animals have claws that are hooked like this. It's not for decoration. It's there's a means they're trying to do something. And then we start looking at the actual, like cortisol levels, for example, right? Like a lot of vets are doing cortisol and stress hormone studies on animals that don't have all of these elements that they're able to interact with their environments. And what happens, right? You get an animal that's supposed to live 10 years, it goes 8. I did everything you told me how to care for it. I did all the gut loading. I did the supplementation. I had all the right lighting. All right. Well, what else do we have to look at, right? We have to look at the actual impact of environmental enrichment on these animals. And does it actually make a real difference? Personally, it's hard for us to provide the information saying this is exact. If you do A, it will equal B. Doesn't always work that way. But I can tell you, I've got a lot of animals that have lived double the amount of time than the average. Am I doing something that's crazy? Not necessarily, but I learn along the way. I don't have all the answers. My opinion, if we do this podcast in a year from now, my opinions might change on what we've talked about, and that's okay. Right. And that's, I think the cool thing about this industry in these formats is, listen, this is okay. It's not all doom and gloom. Like we can evolve and progress as a hobby and as an industry, and have these real talks that aren't, that aren't so negative. And, we got to relish and take those opportunities, to have these conversations with people that have, I love talking to, kids and their families that have their first reptiles and had them for 6 months, just as much as I'd like talking to the person who's been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's crazy. I mean, at some of these expos, I'll have a conversation with like a 7-year-old kid about the care. And I go, I couldn't even imagine having this information in front of me when I was 7 and working with these animals.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
You mentioned
it's amazing.
You mentioned earlier in the show about like really early on in the conversation about how, like when you started, and it was, I felt similarly when I first started too, you'd find books, you'd maybe talk to people, you'd call them on the phone, I'd flip through Reptiles magazine and be psyched for the next issue every time. And I'd flip to the back and I'd call the phone numbers of the people advertising in the very back of the magazine. And I'd be like, what do you think about grasshoppers, like whatever it might be, right? And sometimes people would be like, ugh, and they'd hang the phone up, right? And then sometimes people would just have a great conversation with me. And the fact that we live at a time now when like we put out a podcast every week, like, and we're just one of hundreds, and we are also getting, it's like, you'd wait years for a book that would have maybe 500 pictures in it, but you can scroll through Instagram for 20 minutes and find 1,000 photos of species you would have never seen in those books ever, because they didn't even know they existed at the time, So that like there's this really incredible level of like compression of information and like how you have access to that information. It's like you get so much more from such an easier, smaller package. And like, I had this yesterday. Someone received one of the ornates I sent to them yesterday, and this was like her first reptile pet. And she had spent like 6 months building the enclosure and researching and setting it all up. And then she sent me a photo of the lizard in the enclosure eating a flower that she had fed it, and was like, I didn't even think it was possible to be this excited. And like, I didn't think my expectations could be exceeded this much. And she was just so psyched. Yeah. Her psych level was so high and through the roof. It was just like, man. And the setup looked immaculate, by the way. Like, it was a beautiful
it was perfect.
Perfect setup. Perfect Euro setup. And you're like,
but how excited do you guys get when that happens, right?
Yeah.
Like you're stoked, like,
it's the best.
Yeah. But you want ultimately, and I'm probably speaking for both of you, I want people to be better than me, right? I want people to have more information and to do that. Like I think that's great. And when those situations happen, right? This, you're, the person who created this enclosure for you, or a 7-year-old who's giving me all the care requirements for an animal. I'm like, okay, great. I think that's amazing that there's that part of it. And, as long as we keep on that track of having that free exchange of information and being able to be accessible and transparent, that's where we will be a lot stronger as an industry. There's gatekeeping that needs to happen. And there's other times where there's not, where it's just like, hey, here's what I do. Here's what here's kind of how I feel about things. And, you make your best decisions for you.
Yeah, man. Very well said there. That's for sure. I am also curious. So like, we've been talking about obviously we talked a lot about the sort of like the product side of the industry and quality control and how you guys develop all this stuff. I'm curious, like, what for you personally, and maybe even for, okay, I'm going to try to, I'm going to have a hard time kind of formulating this question, but the basic part of the question is, who or what are some of your influences inside of herpetoculture? And then like, they could be people or institutions, or like they could also be influences that exist outside of what we do. Because, like, I think all the time about the way jujitsu, and I talk about this all the damn time on the show, and people get sick of it, I'm sure. But like, I'm there's like a huge passion of mine is Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and it influences everything I think about, and I can't help but find crossovers here in herpetoculture. Same thing from when I was drawing and painting all the time. There was just, there's so many ways it crosses over, and so many ways where I'm like, oh, like, I kind of like the way that fits into this realm. And I didn't know if you have anything like that for yourself. Just really curious about it.
That is really interesting. I've never thought about it. I'm going to think, take a second to chew on that a second.
Yeah. And it can also be like other, if you're just like, oh, I really miss Burt Langerwer if he was the man. Yeah. That's also an acceptable answer.
I do. I had some great, from slight language barrier when we used to chat, but it was great. I mean, I think that there's certain, and unfortunately too, there are a lot of our industry giants that have passed away over the years, and I could not downplay how gracious a lot of these people were at the time. You look at Bert, more recently, like Bob Mayu, for example. I mean, these were, both he and his wife, and certainly a lot of other people at Sandfire, just the amount of time they would take with a young kid at a show in San Diego back in the Herba days. That was very meaningful, which is kind of, again, tags along with what I said about if you have the opportunity and the time, and then take it when you can. But yeah, Bert was great. I loved how a lot of these people were, I need to be delicate about how I say this because I don't want it to come off wrong, but they were flawed about the information that they provided. And what I mean by that is they were, you were, I mean, I don't know how many conversations you had with Bert. He's like, yeah, well, this kind of worked for me, but this doesn't necessarily, this doesn't necessarily work here. And he would just take the time. Like, I remember I had a ton of conversations with him, in particular about Uromastyx breeding, because he was out of Alabama, if I remember correctly. Right. Yeah. And I'm like, well, what about all the humidity? Like, and he was doing Moroccans, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
So same thing with the Australian water dragons. Like, he was the source for jeweled lacertas and Australian water dragons for basically the whole U.S. industry. And I would talk to him every couple of years, and he was like, not a great year for this one, a little too harsh of a winter, but this is a problem that I have. I'm going to adjust. I'm going to change. So when I say about flaws like that, I mean more of they're very real about the challenges that they faced, and then how they, came up with solutions. And I kind of feel Bob was like that. Bob was like that as well. If you ever had a chance to visit the ranch in its heyday, I mean, you didn't see, no one was doing animals like that way back then. Like, even if we use the microcosm of like everyone breeding in Florida right now, like, you go to Sandfire and it was a world set apart way back when. But Bob was always very deliberate about his interactions with people. There are some old heads out there that kind of came up around the same time that I did, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Roy, but do you know East Bay Vivarium up there in Berkeley? Yeah. So
I've been going there since I was 3 years old.
Yeah, one of the best pet stores, one of the best reptile stores in the country, right? It's just like their East Bay is very East Bay, and John Emberton, I've known him for a lot, and just be able to chat with him too about stuff. And it's funny because they're just real people, right? Like, you can have just a great conversation with them talking over a beer at a bar, as you are getting some time with them at their store in the back area where they're breeding their boas. He was always a great resource. When I was younger, kind of growing up, just because we were friends, right? So, or at least friendly, where we can have those chats. Current day, some of the people that I really enjoy talking to is Josh Willard from Josh's Frogs. Yeah. He's a wealth of information. He has an amazing head on his shoulders. We have some very deep conversations about history and solutions. A great resource out there as well. Some of the zoos there too. A lot of the keepers from like San Diego Zoo over the years, like having a chance to chat with them. I think that we also have to start looking at the university side of things too. I went to UCLA, and I worked with, at least for a upper level course with Dr. I don't know if he's still teaching, but Dr. Nagy. And I remember because he was not from the pet side at all. Like, and I remember when I gave my final presentation, I think I did, like chameleon morphology, functional morphology and physiology, if I remember correctly. And I brought in like live animals for my final presentation there. No one's ever done that before. So, I was going over so many different things, and it was, but he wasn't on the pet side. So when we did our practicums and going through like all the Southern California specimens that they had, just to talk with him and just to learn where their heads are at, and then what they're looking at, and then even to open their eyes up to like, hey, this is also a big part of studying. Like, how many people that want to go into the research side started with a pet bearded dragon, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right.
I know the answer is not zero.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's definitely not zero. No kidding.
I think about that all the time. Yeah.
It's so funny. I remember. I only ever had a single like email exchange with Bert once, and it was just about asking to buy a lizard. I never got to meet him or speak with him or anything like that. And then same thing with Bob. I never knew him. But I always remember looking at what they were doing and seeing like the level of effort and care that they were putting into every aspect of what they were up to. And I always found that, and like just the level of passion they were bringing to the table, like it was never like, there was never any of like this negativity or pessimism or industry bashing or whatever. It was a very like positively minded, interested, introspective, and open-minded orientation towards the work that we do, you know? And so it was always like, it's really motivating. And, you know, I have to say, one of the not so insignificant reasons for us starting this show was, you know, I remember we had this conversation when we first started. We said, if nothing else at all, this is an opportunity for us to get more on the record from some of these people who are still around right now. You know, like it just so happens, like it's, you know, and it sounds really grim and kind of dark, but like the reality is that at some point, every person who's on this show is going to be dead, you know, like including us. And so it's not meant to be dark. It's just meant to say, you know, what I wouldn't give for a handful of conversations out there that were 2 or 3 hours long with Bert or Bob. I mean, I would kill for those that are on record somewhere, you know, and they're just not there. And the fact that we have some of those and we're continuing to build that library. I mean, if nothing else, show can be a library of those sorts of things. You know, so it's just like, I didn't really have like a question or anything.
Yeah, it kind of goes into that comment I made about Emmanuel doing that chameleon expedition in Kenya, right? It's like you want to leave a positive footprint behind. You don't want to just leave it there and be like, hey, I was here. Like you want to leave a little bit of an impact. And you know, I'm not so delusional to say that I'm leaving this great impact on the industry. And I've been in it a long time. I try to interact with as many people as possible. I try to be as accessible as possible. But at the same time, you know, I'm a flawed person, right? Like sometimes I don't have as much time as I think in any given day. This was reason I even bring that up too is you were asking about outside influences. You know, I listen to a ton of podcasts that are not reptile related at all. And I think as far as sociological studies go, and definitely on the psychology side and different ways of solving problems, I tend to gravitate towards people and institutions that are very willing to adjust when they need to adjust, right? Like it's again, horrible analogy, but I think you guys might get this, but there are often times where people in general, like once their style is there, that's their style the rest of the year, right? Their hair, their clothes, like they hit whatever that is, right? 37, 47, whatever. And then they're the same. And they're like, I am who I am. And this is my opinion. And that actually, not the clothes part, but the part where you're not willing to go, like the world keeps going, guys. Like it's going, like I'm not going to be the reason why this industry or the people that I care about stop growing. Right. And I don't want them to leave me behind because I chose to stop doing that as well. And I take that philosophy very seriously in the information that I digest. And then certainly the information that we, that we put out there as a brand. It's why I love interacting with the Hagens in our company and Emmanuel Van Hagen, unrelated, but Emmanuel too on our product side, because we can get together. And when you start getting reptile nerds in a room going over like, what if we do this? And how about this for next year? And all of a sudden you're pumped for something that's not even going to happen for 24 to 48 months. That's great. I love it. Like that's very impactful for me. It's my elixir, and moving forward.
Right. Absolutely. That's remarkable. Well, so we're creeping up on 90-ish minutes or so here. And what I'd like to do, because I want to be mindful of and respectful of your time, I would like to maybe ask you just a couple of finishing questions, and then we have a final question that we ask at the end of every show, but I'll get to that in a second. So some of the closers or the sort of ending questions would be, and you could take these together or pull these two questions apart, whatever you like. The first is like, what about herpetoculture excites you right now? And then secondarily, like, what are your goals for the future? And I know, it doesn't have to be, I know there's lots of product goals and whatnot. And this could be both you and Exo Terra related. It could be both. It could be separately. Like what are some aspirations that you might have, say, not maybe for the next 5 to 10, but like before you die kind of thing? Does that make sense?
No, totally. I was just writing them down to make sure I
Sure.
kept myself on track, because if you guys have noticed in the last 90 minutes, I tend to go very much on off. I ultimately get back to the topic, but I go very much on tangents.
Oh, it's awesome. It's perfect. Yeah.
Oh, that's the best.
Exactly
man.
what we want.
That's what we. It's what we want.
Lean into that.
So I could
We're
go
gonna fully
into
enable that behavior.
Yeah, I try. You just get off. I think that to a compliment for you guys, it's a comfortable environment that you've created on this podcast, which is kind of nice too.
Thank you.
So yeah, you're welcome. What excites me about this is, so I love the new crop that's coming up in the industry. I love that they are not necessarily. I think that they're more accepting of how nuanced things are, and I'm talking about when it comes to product availability, care, even social media footprints. I think that they're a lot more conscious than I've ever been, and that I ever will be. Like, I just don't think I have the tools to go that direction, and I'm really excited that we are handing off the baton to a lot of people that care very, very much for the industry as a whole, for the people in the industry, for the hobby side of things, for the animals, definitely, right? And I kind of saw it. So are you guys familiar with Animal Con? It was maybe a month or two ago.
Yeah.
That community is infectiously, for the most part, very, very positive, right? Like, when you look at the content creators and influencers, and then whatever new moniker is going to come up when those two are used up, right? I'm sure we'll have something else in the future, but interacting with them, we all have to realize that sometimes their social media face it's still transactional a little bit to a degree, right? But then you get them in real time, and you're like, oh, I get what you're trying to do now. Like, I understand. And their want to stay cohesive as a community, to me, is also amazing. I loved interacting with all of them at this event. I learned a lot at that moment. I also learned that we as a brand need to make sure that those interactions are a lot more organic than we thought they were to begin with, right? Yeah. It's a matter of their text. Some people are texting me, or we're like, hey, why don't we partner up on this? And I don't even mean like partner up on hey, we'll give you X if we get Y. It's more of hey, I kind of want to pick your brain on this. Do you mind if we just send you something? Give me your feedback on this, because I think you're doing what we want to do and who we want to interact with when it comes to product development, right? So, happy accidents along the way. So, that to me is amazing. I think that people you guys cuss on the show, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think people are getting a lot better at sorting through the bullshit. Yeah. I really do. I think that it's sometimes you could kind of see, and I don't mean just, BS in regards to holding people back. I think sometimes, like, it doesn't make sense. Like, that way of doing things just doesn't make sense anymore with the availability of items that are out there. And also sometimes there's means to an end, and people have to realize that in order to do this type of breeding or to provide this type of animal, we have to make some sacrifices in environments, for example. And other times that's not the case. So I think the new crop of individuals that are coming up in this industry, and then certainly people that are willing to adjust care requirements on the fly, is a very positive thing that I'm excited about right now. Because if you asked me that question 10 years ago, did you think that that's where we'd be going? Like, oh my God, the battles that we're going through, just trying to change someone's mind because there was an article that said, do this, this, and this. And all of a sudden that's the Bible. That's kind of hard to swallow when you're 10 years removed, considering how everything has changed. So, I see that adjusting a little bit. I see Philip, to your point, when it comes down to like an Instagram post, right? Like, this animal, they gave me the longitude and latitude of where this is found. I didn't even know these animals existed right there, but that's amazing. Yeah. That free exchange of information. And I think the ability to be able to use that in a positive manner more so than ever is amazing to me. I think it's killer. I think it's great. I think that as I get older in this thing, and I don't necessarily have the energy anymore, I'm pretty happy that it's being left in the right hands. Hopefully, maybe I'm being optimistic, but hopefully that's kind of where I see things going.
No, that's awesome. I totally agree with that. I mean, if doing this show feels like it's sort of taught me that too, which is like, holy crap, there are so many people thinking about this in intelligent, mindful, ethical, considerate, and conscientious ways. And it's like, oh, it just gives you so much more confidence in what the future looks like for what we're doing. So I totally couldn't agree with you more on that. That's great. I agree. Love that answer. And sorry, go ahead. I didn't want to.
I was gonna say, were you gonna go to the goals part?
No, stay on this. Please, no, let's go. No, go for it. No.
I know where my goals are. We can stay on this. We can stay on this stuff if we have anything else.
Well, no, actually, I was going to go on to the next question, but if you have,
I want to hear it.
Yeah, I want to hear that.
Yeah. I think that this kind of goes into a staying busy in a constantly evolving and fast world. Is personally, I'd like to kind of take a step back some more and enjoy it for what it is as we get a little older. I mean, the grind is great, right, guys? We hear about it all the time. The grind is great until it grinds you down to where you can't do it anymore. So, I'm now, my mortality staring at me in the face a little bit more, where it's like, maybe I don't need to fly so much, or maybe I don't need to, do all of this when, we can do things like this over Zoom, or a phone call or text message. So I think I'm taking a lot more stock into that and trying to enjoy things a little more on the personal scale, which also goes into my keeping practices too. There are little things that I like to do with my animals just to ease my my care requirements, to make sure, I've realized like maybe I need to kind of take a step back from this species just because I am not doing everything that I could with the space that I have. So, I shouldn't be so stubborn as to move on from a project. I didn't fail at it. I'm just not where I wanted to be with this animal. And then go and continue on with these species that I am working with and the care, because I used to love creating my own enclosures. Like, it was magic for me. Like, I cut my own glass, siliconed everything. Like, I loved it. And then I got to a point where I'm like, I could not build a single one again. Like, if I never have to build another enclosure again, trust me, I would rather not. So, getting back into that, like doing these strange things, like, you can't really see it, it's blurred out behind me, but on a lot of my quarantine and my neonate raising tanks, I've drilled drainage systems in to the bottom of all of them now. So they're all bioactive live enclosures, but now instead of having to, take a turkey baster and get the water out, I have a drip tray to the bottom of my enclosure. So I just drop all of that. So nothing is ever really dirty. So all I'm really doing is wiping the poop off the glass. And that to me is great, because that's therapeutic for me. I can listen to something, throw Netflix on in the background and just wipe glass. That's great, right? Like, to me, that's kind of what I want to get back into, because I find myself going back to some of these species that I've had basically nonstop for, since the mid 90s, early 90s. And I'm now finding myself enjoying them more again, as opposed to looking at them like a fish tank, right? Like, you feed your fish, you clean up your filter. To me, it's more of a like, oh, that's really cool that I was able to do that again. I found out some more stuff with brumation recently this year for a lot of the animals that I was breeding. And starting to really take stock into like, oh, the weight on that one's a little different, but my female yield was higher. But what does the mortality rate look like that in order to get the higher female yield? Like, I love stuff like that, because I can go through and talk to someone else and say, here's my situation, right? Like, my room temperature in Chicago in the winter drops to this. I start feeding them with more frequency in this month. And that is where I kind of want to get back into, because that's something that I got a lot of pleasure in many, many years ago. And I think that as I pull back a little bit and take more time with family and friends, as we probably all do, I'm realizing it more and more now as I get older.
Wow.
Love it.
Man, great.
Yeah. just like more focused enjoyment. It sounds like
it's got to happen at some point, right?
Goal.
Has to.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Has to happen. It's good to hear prioritized. Well, yeah, I think we should move to our closing question.
Yeah, man.
Good with everybody. All right. So Steve, our closing question is the same for every guest. And I know you've heard the show before, so you've probably heard it before, but the question is, why herpetoculture? And that could be, why do you do it? Why do we do it? Why does it matter? Why herpetoculture?
I think this is probably, I guess it's got to be for everyone, right? I think it's very personal to me. Without sounding too grandiose, I kind of feel like I've had the opportunity over the years, both from my own skill set, a lot of happy accidents, to be handed a stewardship of this industry. I'm a relatively private person in this industry, so you see me around, but I don't make a big stink online. I kind of work, I do a little marionetting in the background when it comes to this, but I still love it passionately. And I can never not thank the people that have kind of helped me along the way. When you look at Hagen, the Hagens in general, having the confidence in me to make sure that I manage the brand for the US, working with Emmanuel too to understand our part, and working with all of our accounts and the public in general. Like, I can never discount that not everyone has had that opportunity, right? Like it's what is it? It's opportunity, luck, and preparation. And sometimes all those three things have to be married together. So years ago, it's funny when I look at what I wanted to do as a kid versus what I went to college for versus where I am now.
Yeah.
Right? Like you ask 11-year-old, 12-year-old me, I want to work with reptiles my whole life. Like, I mean, back then, what were you going to be? You're going to work at a pet store, right? Like, I didn't know that there wasn't any large scale reptile breeding back then. It was just, it didn't exist. So to be able to bring that into a profession that I thrive in, and being able to add to it and work to protect it, is very meaningful for me. So that to me is like why herpetoculture, right? It's real for me. It's in my blood. I think it'll always be in my blood. Whether I'm at this thing for the rest of my life or I decide to move on to something else tomorrow, it's always going to be a part of who I am. And hopefully, that those footprints and those fingerprints on this industry, hopefully I've left a lasting and meaningful part behind whenever I'm done with it. But yeah, that's I think that's it in a nutshell. It's just, we're not all given the opportunity to be as interactive with this living, breathing thing, as other people would want to. And I had to be better about not discounting that when people come through and say like, "Hey, you're so lucky. That's awesome that you do this." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm always tired." It's. I had to really step away from that and realize that no, this was a really cool opportunity, and hopefully I can continue to make an impact out there over the next few years or decades.
Yeah, dude. Not only is that a great answer, but yeah, I'm tired too. I get it, man.
Yeah, not enough time. Well, right, Phil, you want 30. If you had 30 hours in the day, it would be great because you could get anything done, but you're just going to be more tired.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's more true.
Yeah. It's weird because like, you just mentioned something there that I relate to as well. Like, what I'm doing now is so much more aligned with what I would have said I want to do when I'm a kid in a lot of ways, because, I went to college for art and drawing and painting and illustration and stuff. But when I was a kid, if you'd asked me what you want to do, when I was in like 5th grade, I'd have been like, well, I want to breed a lot of lizards and I want to wrestle. I just want to wrestle. I just want to do those two things. I was like, oh, I do those now. Yeah. But then what you don't know is there's all this other external sort of admin stuff, like back end stuff that you have to do in order to do those things as often as you want to do them. And that will just, man, it can just sap your energies in a way that it's like, it's very difficult to elaborate on. And it doesn't mean you don't enjoy it any less or anything like that. It's just like, boy, talk about trade-offs. I didn't even know.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yep.
Yeah, I feel like I'm constantly like resisting the external pressures to speed up. I'm like, I'm trying to slow down, more and more and more. I think it's hard to do because that's not the direction that our society is going at all. And like, I always have this, I've said this on the show before, I'm sure at some point in the past, but I always have this refrain in my head from one of my wildlife tracking mentors. And he said, the only way to have more time is to slow down.
Man.
And this is just like, wow. It's so true. And it's so, it's just not, everything else is saying the other thing. Go faster, do more.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's funny out there. Just everyone's got a different perspective. Right? Like I've got my, my best friend is running 1,000,000 miles per hour, but his mentality is like, if I grind now, at least I won't have to grind later and I can enjoy it. And then, he and I have some very frank conversations because we're both of similar mindset, but at the same time, it's like, oh my God, are you so tired? Like, can we just take a break? And then you go into panic mode when you do take a break, right?
Yeah.
We've all been there. We're like, I don't know if I can take the time off. But meanwhile, you'll tell everyone else that'll listen, make sure you take the time, right? Anytime you get, take the time off, take your vacation days. But meanwhile, you're like, I don't know. I guess I'm going to work during Christmas, I guess. I mean, no one else. I'm not getting any emails coming in. I might as well.
Oh, man, for sure. Familiar. Oh, God. Well, look, this has been an incredible conversation, and I'm really happy that we got to have it. I really appreciate you taking the time because I know we're just going off about how busy we all are. So it really means a lot. And hopefully, in the future, hopefully in the near future, not so far away, we could do another one because, there's probably a million different things we could touch on and talk about that you have great insights on. So hopefully you'll come back on and have another one with it.
Absolutely. No, it was a lot of fun. Thank you, gentlemen. It was awesome. It was great.
Thank you too, Steve. We really
Thanks, Steve.
Roy, you want to hit the button really quick and then we'll...
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hit the button and we'll stop